Today at the National Press Club, Chair of the Australian Climate and Biodiversity Foundation and former Treasury Secretary Ken Henry. He'll discuss how national environment laws can help restore nature and power the net zero economy. Ken Henry with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to today's Westpac National Press Club address. I'm Greg Jennett, Director here at the club. Introducing Ken Henry, who speaks to us today in his capacity as Chair of the Australian Climate and Biodiversity Foundation. So, Dr. Henry is going to address the need to reinvigorate lawmaking around the Environment Protection, Biodiversity and Conservation Act. I think it's timely for a few reasons. The 48th Parliament is soon to begin, and there's some unfinished business in this area for the Albanese government on environmental laws. Now, Ken Henry, I think it's fair to say, is pretty well known in policy circles nationally and here in the capital in Canberra. He's a former Treasury Secretary, a former Chair of the National Australia Bank, and what I might describe as an inveterate reviewer of Australia's tax system. I think it's been a somewhat unfulfilling endeavour so far for Ken, but he's been tenacious, if nothing else, in pursuing that. There's more we could say about his credentials and his positions held, but he is a familiar figure, so we won't run through your full and distinguished CV here today, Ken. No doubt there will be questions later on tax and productivity, you might be pleased to hear, in light of the Treasurer's forthcoming Productivity Summit. But for now, let's welcome Dr. Ken Henry for his Westpac National Press Club address entitled Our Last Best Chance, National Environment Laws to Restore Nature and Power the Net Zero Economy. Ken Henry.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, and thank you, Morrison. Thank you for the opportunity to address this important group of people on such an important topic. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Also want to acknowledge a number of people in the room, colleagues past and present, although honestly I don't know where to draw the line these days between past and present colleagues. But it's particularly good to see Guy Bell here, David Parker, Steve Hatfield Dodds. There's quite a few very familiar faces around the room and I'm pleased to see them. I would also like to acknowledge, as Morris already has, the members of Parliament who are in the audience with us today, Alicia Payne, the federal member for Canberra, Senator Karen Grogan, Senator David Pocock. I want to particularly acknowledge Senator Hanson-Young, and I want to call her out because of something which may not be well known to you, but she has become quite an advocate for the interests of those people who spend their lives looking after injured and orphaned native animals, which is dear to my heart, so thank you. Well, I'm addressing you today, as has already been noted, in my capacity as Chair of the Australian Climate and Biodiversity Foundation, the ACBF. And the ACBF is a not-for-profit founded in 2021 to help decision makers find means of securing the restoration of Australia's natural environment, but in ways that support a thriving 21st century economy. And in the audience today with us we have people from the Foundation. I'm pleased that they have been able to join us today. My colleague on the board, Tim Reid, in particular, and the Executive Director, Lyndon Schneiders, and others. We, in this organisation, bring together leaders from business and environmental organisations together with subject matter experts to develop economically rational policy approaches to securing Australia's net zero climate goals and also Australia's commitment to the Global Biodiversity Framework's goal to halt and reverse the loss of nature by 2030. And I'm here with you today to make the case for urgent reforms of Australia's broken national environment laws, enshrined in the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC, a misnomer if ever there was one. Clearly, this is not a small task. There have been 3 failed attempts to reform these laws in the past 15 years. It's not because reform's not essential. Reform is absolutely essential. And the time to get this done is now. The EPBC Act has patently failed to halt the degradation of Australia's natural environment. That's well understood. Report after report tells the same story of failure. The environment is simply not being protected. Biodiversity is not being conserved. Nature is in systemic decline. Independent reviews confirm that the environmental impact assessment systems embedded in the laws are simply not fit for purpose. Of particular concern, these laws are incapable of supporting an economy in transition to net zero. They are also undermining Australia's productivity. We simply cannot afford slow, opaque, duplicative and contested environmental planning decisions based on poor information, mired in administrative complexity. And it's not just the net zero challenge, right? Housing construction, not keeping pace with the growing population, must be accelerated. The resilience of agricultural production must be enhanced. We must exploit opportunities to develop a sophisticated, more diverse economy, and that will include capability in advanced manufacturing. Environmental laws should be helping all of these things, not standing as an obstacle, not hindering. Recently, the Treasurer Chalmers in this place presented a cogent argument for an economic policy program focused on productivity, resilience and budget sustainability. Reforming our broken environmental laws is an obvious lever to enhance resilience and to lift moribund productivity growth. And reforms provide an opportunity to cut the cost to government, both Commonwealth and states, dramatically. Now, of course, I can think of other reforms to boost productivity, some even harder than this, though none more important than this. And if we can't achieve environmental law reforms, then we should stop dreaming about more challenging options. Moreover, environmental law reform provides an opportunity to reconstruct the cooperative federal reform capability that I recall us developing in the 1990s, but which we since appear to have lost. A strong federal reform capability will be required to deliver other even more challenging economic reforms. And it seems to me that environmental law reform provides the opportunity to build the template for a renewed Commonwealth-state cooperation. I'm the 3rd speaker since 2021 to address the National Press Club on the need for the reform of national environmental laws, following former Environment Ministers Susan Lee and Tanya Plibersek. Both of those ministers detailed myriad problems with the existing laws. Both pledged to implement the far-reaching reforms recommended by the independent review chaired by my long-term comrade in economic reform, Graham Samuel, during 2019 and 2020. And yet, despite the extraordinarily high quality of Graham's review and the strong commitment of those ministers, who come obviously from opposite sides of the political fence, despite all of that, here we are in the winter of 2025, nothing has changed. There's been plenty of activity. Policy papers have been drafted and endorsed at the highest levels of government. Bills have been drafted and debated. There have been endless rounds of consultation. Acres of literal and virtual newsprint have been generated by those arguing the merits and the costs of reforms. Parliamentary committees have come and gone. But the laws, well, they haven't moved an inch. Not a single reform has been implemented. We've got to ask the question, why? You might think there's something special about this area of public policy, that there's something that distinguishes it from all others. You might assume, for example, that this policy paralysis simply describes a stalemate in some inescapable contest between economic development and the environment. And it's certainly true that protagonists in environmental policy debates will often encourage the view that if one side wins, then the other necessarily loses. It might not surprise any of you, therefore, that the political system seems to find it impossible to make a choice. But this is not what has been going on. For a start, if this were merely a contest between the environment and development, then I'd suggest that somebody needs to explain why it is that whilst the pace of environmental degradation has been accelerating, our economic performance has also been deteriorating. This is not a win-lose outcome. This is a lose-lose outcome. Coincidence? Well, I don't think so. I look at our debates over environmental law reforms and I'm reminded of some of the indulgent economic policy debates of the 1970s. Understandable, perhaps. Indulgent, certainly. And costly. There's nothing reasonable about policy paralysis. Not in any area of public policy. In a country that must secure higher productivity growth to meet the legitimate expectations of its young people, policy paralysis must be unacceptable. The title of this address is Our Last Best Chance. And I mean it, last, because if we do not secure these reforms in this term of Parliament, then neither the net zero nor global biodiversity framework commitments will retain a shred of credibility. And it's our best chance because the solutions and the remedies to fix the mess are not only clear, they also enjoy broad stakeholder support. That doesn't mean the reforms are going to be easy. No reform is. Commercial and political vested interests are always tempted to exploit the moments of uncertainty that are necessarily generated with any reform proposal. And for some, the stakes are high, right? After all, we in this country have whole industries with business models built on the destruction of the natural world. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. But high stakes were also a feature of the economic reforms of the 1980s and 1990s. These reforms of the 80s and 90s mostly enjoy broad business and political support today. But they were not easy at the time, having lived through all of them, I can tell you that. And they were not easy for the same reason. Yet they too were necessary. Graham Samuel's review, made 38 recommendations to change the trajectory of nature loss and to ease the burden of the complexity, confusion and meaningless process. It's been a cause of frustration to landholders and the business community, and which has undermined national productivity. Graham found that the EPBC Act is, and I'll quote from him, it's outdated and requiring fundamental reform. He found that it's complex and cumbersome, powerless to stem the rate of ongoing and accelerating decline. He found that it's not fit to address current or future environmental challenges. Graham's review concluded that good outcomes for the environment, including heritage, cannot be achieved under the current laws. Remarkably, the wide-ranging set of recommendations was supported by both business and environmental organisations, and support from both camps remains strong today, despite 2 parliamentary terms marked by a failure to pass the necessary legislation. In the meantime, the world has become increasingly uncertain. I would go so far as to say hostile. Democratic systems of governance are on the back foot all around the world. But democracy is not broken here in Australia. We do have the opportunity in Australia right now to show the world what good looks like, just as we did in the 1980s, just as we did in the 1990s. And it's vital that we do so. We cannot afford the policy complacency of recent decades. It's costing us too much. Opportunities of goodwill and alignment, these cannot be wasted. So, what's at stake in environmental law reforms? According to the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, we'll need to spend about $122 billion in new large-scale renewable generation, storage and transmission to deliver a reliable and decarbonised electricity grid. We'll need to triple grid-scale renewable capacity between now and 2030, get your head around it, and increase it 6-fold by 2050. And yet, the average time for EPBC assessment and approval of a wind farm or a solar farm blew out from a bit over 500 days in 2018 to 831 days in 2021. According to the Clean Energy Investor Group, in the years 2018 through to 2024, 124 renewables projects across Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria required assessment under the EPBC Act. Only 28 were either approved or rejected. According to the Climate Change Authority, if we are to achieve net zero by 2050, then we are going to have to sequester, that is, take into vegetation and soils, 2.5 times as much carbon every year as is estimated to be taken out of the atmosphere this year, 2.5 times as much. Extracting new supplies of critical minerals is also essential to decarbonisation efforts, with lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite required for batteries, and new supplies of copper deemed essential for new and extended energy transmission systems. The Australian Government has an ambition to massively increase critical minerals exports and downstream processing here in Australia. This means more mines, it means new industrial facilities, it means more pressure being loaded onto broken EPBC project assessment and approval processes. The Government has also targeted the construction, as you know, of an additional 1.2 million homes by 2030. More residential land, more greenfield development sites, more transport corridors, and more interaction with the EPBC assessment and approval processes. These projects, whether they be wind farms, solar farms, transmission lines, new housing developments, land-based carbon sequestration programs, new and enhanced transport corridors, or critical minerals extraction and processing facilities, these must be delivered, and they must be delivered quickly. They must be delivered efficiently. They must be delivered in a way that not only protects, but restores nature. To put it bluntly, there is no chance of Australia meeting stated targets for net zero, for renewable energy, for critical minerals development, for housing and transport infrastructure, without very high quality national laws that set clear environmental standards for major projects, without a strong national regulator respected by all parties, and without significant improvement not only in Commonwealth environmental protection systems, but also in those of the states and territories. And all these projects will be critical to enhancing economic resilience and lifting Australia's flagging productivity growth. Boosting productivity and resilience relies upon environmental reform. But the biggest threat to future productivity growth comes from nature itself, more particularly from its destruction. Gradually, economic policy minds around the world have woken up to the fact that time is fast running out for the natural world, the foundation of all life on Earth. It is now well accepted that a degraded and natural world poses myriad threats to food systems, to the provision of clean air and water, and the continuing supply of other ecosystem services that are critical to human life and critical to industrial production processes. And it's well accepted that things are getting worse, much worse, and at an accelerating rate. They are not getting better. Australia's natural wealth, for example, is undermined by invasive species, by the consequences of climate change, by land clearing, which is ongoing, by habitat destruction, poor fire management. In our remnant forests, the habitats of endangered species, including the koala and the greater glider, these continue to be logged, they continue to be cleared. About 100 million hectares of forests have been cleared since 1788, and remarkably this practice continues with an average of 40,000 hectares of primary and secondary forest cleared each year between 2015 and 2019, 400,000 hectares annually. The most recent National State of the Environment report confirms a state of crisis, finding that our inability to adequately manage pressure will continue to result in species extinction and deteriorating ecosystem condition, which are reducing the environmental capital on which current and future economies depend. That's what the most recent report found. 105 Australian species have been recorded extinct already, including 10% of all known mammal species. A further 21% of all remaining mammal species are currently threatened with extinction. 741 species have been added to the threatened species list since 2000. In total, 2,138 animal and plant species are now considered to be at threat of extinction. We're pretty good at listing this stuff. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which was influential when I was growing up around the world, it's happening here in Australia, but not driven by pesticides so much as by a determined commitment to clear the bush and to destroy the natural world. And in this, we are passing to future generations a legacy of unsustainable plunder, compounded by the impacts of a rapidly changing climate. Globally, humanity's degradation of nature has contributed to recursive environmental dynamics characterised by tightly integrated vicious cycles involving pollution of the atmosphere, of the hydrosphere and the biosphere. We humans have created deserts. We've rendered waterways so toxic that they're incapable of supporting marine life, fit for human consumption, or indeed any marine life at all, and we've seen that in Australia. Crops have been failing with increasing frequency and severity. Millions of hectares of land on this continent have been rendered unfit for agricultural activity or condemned to very low productivity due to the leaching of nutrients, acidification, soil erosion and chemical toxicity, covered these days in herbicide-resistant exotic weeds and feral pests. It's some achievement. Instead of affording protection from wild weather events, the natural environment is now their accelerator. We've turned nature against us. Our destruction of the natural environment now poses an existential threat to everything that we value. We need to change course. And that will not happen without high integrity laws, without high integrity regulation. We need a new collective mindset that understands the state of nature in the 21st century, that accepts that nature needs repair, and that understands that that necessarily imposes constraints on the choices that we make. We do need faster, more certain project approvals processes, no question, but we also need a more resilient and nature-rich environment. With due acknowledgement of the genius of AC/DC, there is no point in building a faster highway to hell. The concept of ecologically sustainable development, ESD, which seeks to balance economic, social and environmental goals, and which has been the foundation of environment policy in Australia, as in many other countries for the past 30 years, it needs serious rethinking. ESD lies at the heart of the EPBC Act, but Graham, in his review, found, and I'll quote, "The Act lacks clear national outcomes and effective mechanisms to address environmental decline." I'm still quoting, "Ecologically sustainable development is a key principle of the Act, but it is not being applied." Well, you know what? It cannot be applied project by project in the manner anticipated by the Act. Project by project application of ESD is simply nuts. It's time we stop pretending we have the cognitive discipline to choose a sustainable balance among economic, social and environmental goals project by project. That is nuts. Project by project, we will always undervalue natural capital for two simple reasons that economists have known about since long before I was born. The first reason has a spatial dimension. Nature is so vast that one project's negative impact will always seem immaterial. Ignoring the environmental impact of a single project is a form of free riding. The second reason has a temporal dimension. The cost of nature's degradation is, of course, overwhelmingly borne by future generations, not by us. We have found it very difficult to stop ourselves stealing from the future. This is a form of intergenerational myopia. Free riding and intergenerational myopia can only be addressed by collective action. In respect of environmental degradation, that means legislation, that means regulation. That's why we have the EPBC Act. But the EPBC Act is not fit for purpose. As Graham Samuel found, the EPBC Act has done little more than record the degradation of the natural world one project at a time. And without major reform, that's all it's ever going to do. I have previously, in other places, described our failure to steward our natural resources as an intergenerational tragedy, as intergenerational theft, even as a willful act of intergenerational bastardry. I guess I'm in danger of running out of printable descriptions to convey the gravity of the situation. Clearly, I'm upset. I'm angry at our failures. But we should, all of us, be angry at our collective failure to design economic structures, including environmental regulations, that underpin confidence in a better future for our children and our grandchildren. We've known about these problems for years now. Environmental policy's too hard basket is overflowing with important ideas. The too hard basket is simply an indictment of those who have been prepared to sacrifice the nation's future. In other policy areas affected by free riding and myopia, economists usually argue the case for binding constraints on behaviour. At the very least, transparency mechanisms that modify decision-making. This is where the Charter of Budget Honesty came from, for example. The case for recognising the immutable laws of nature as binding constraints on human activity is unarguable. After all, if we breach too many of these laws, then humanity itself ceases to exist. Now, that's a bleak message. The good news, and this is why I'm talking to you today, is that we do still have time to get this right. We should choose to do so with glistening ambition. Our ambition should be to build an efficient, jobs-rich, globally competitive, high productivity, low emissions, nature-rich economy. Surely. Surely. Realising that ambition will take time, of course, decades probably. But this Parliament can put in place the key policy settings that will be required. Like most of the other things that will be required to boost productivity, our federal system of government is going to have a special role to play here. Historically, environmental policies have been characterised by occasional outbreaks of national leadership, separated by much longer periods of sullen bickering between the Commonwealth and the states and territories. We need a new approach. We need national leadership, we need real funding support from the Commonwealth, and we need a stronger effort from the states and territories. We do need genuine cooperation in pursuit of a shared goal, and we need new policy instruments. The EPBC Act lacks effective instruments. It was constructed around the consolidation of pre-existing but separate pieces of Commonwealth legislation that had been in operation from the late 1990s, concerned with the management of development impacts upon defined matters of national environmental significance, including world and national heritage matters, listed threatened species and ecological communities, listed migratory birds, important wetlands, of course, Commonwealth marine areas, nuclear actions, and water resources impacted by unconventional gas developments and large coal mines. It identifies 8 separate objects, 16 separate goals, but it doesn't have a core purpose. It simply bundles together a hodgepodge of things that had accumulated over the 25 years preceding it. It contains a raft of exemptions, a raft of carve-outs that collectively make a nonsense of its claims to environmental protection. It lacks the powers to regulate or indeed in any way address native forest logging operations, land clearing, deforestation, nor does it have the power to address the impacts of climate change on the natural environment. Concerns about the effectiveness and efficiency of the Act were raised from the outset, certainly by the opposition of the day, by a raft of scientific experts, by many people in the environmental movement. By the time of the first independent review of the legislation, that commenced in 2008, led by my former friend and colleague, the late Dr. Alan Hawke, these concerns were ringing alarm bells. Alan's final report made 71 recommendations, including a proposal to replace the Act in its entirety with a new piece of legislation, the Australian Environment Act it was to be called, to establish an independent Environment Commission, to develop environmental accounts and better data to make more use of strategic assessments and regional plans, to undertake regular audits, to introduce a greenhouse trigger to assess the environmental impacts of large new polluting projects, and to improve the transparency of decision-making. Well, none of these recommendations was acted upon. Rather, and perversely, the Abbott government proposed to further weaken the role of the Commonwealth by handing final project approval powers to the states and territories. And unsurprisingly, that proposal didn't make it through the Senate. That is the background for Graham Samuel's review. Core to Graham's proposed reforms is a set of binding national environmental standards and enforceable rules to apply to all environmental decision-making and to apply nationwide. These standards would specify in detail, with a minimum of discretion, how matters of national environmental significance would be managed, how they'd be protected, and how they'd be restored where required. Graham recommended removing all of the special carve-outs and exemptions contained in the Act. He also recommended clear and unambiguous principles, language and terms. Standards would be backed by high-integrity data and evidence that would inform decision-making, that would replace the project-by-project, species-by-species approach that's hardwired into the Act, replace it with a landscape and regional approach. Regional plans would enable the identification of areas that should not be developed, areas required for long-term restoration, and those areas where development assessments could proceed rapidly. ESD would not be applied project by project, but region by region. In this way, dealing with the spatial and intertemporal challenges to rational decision-making, to which I referred earlier. Taken together, these recommendations would deliver the quick no and the quick yes sought by business. Equally, strong environmental standards could provide instruments for accrediting decision-making systems at the state and territory level. Subnational jurisdictions would need to demonstrate that they can protect the national interest and deliver Commonwealth responsibilities. Accreditation would remove duplication and complexity, and it would dramatically shorten the time lags confronting developers. Finally, Graham recommended independent oversight of significant parts of the reform laws, particularly in respect of compliance, enforcement and assurance. And this was in recognition that, and I'll quote from him again, the community and industry does not trust the EPBC Act and there is merit in their concerns, unquote. Graham's recommendations were backed by both business and environmental organisations, as I've said earlier, and yet here we are, 5 years on, and nothing. In all reform proposals, the devil inhabits the detail. And the detail, to be fair, remains contested. Development interests have favoured the fast-tracking of those reforms that reduce complexity and facilitate accreditation of subnationals. Environmental interests have preferred a focus on new protections. It's all understandable. It's created a deadlock and we need to break the deadlock. Reforms must be delivered in one package. Key elements of the reform package are these. First, genuine cooperation and a shared purpose among the Commonwealth, states and territories, and business and environmental groups. Responsibilities to future generations are shared after all. Second, protecting and restoring matters of national environmental significance through three things. Firstly, inserting into the Act a clear and overriding new purpose or object concerned with protection and restoration. It should be there. Secondly, shifting the focus to regional planning. It's necessary. And third, resourcing the newly established Environment Information Australia to identify matters of national environmental significance and to monitor the achievement of the goal to protect and reverse the loss of nature by 2030. The third component that's required is the urgent finalisation of effective national environmental standards to support clear decision-making and to facilitate the accreditation of state and territory systems. Fourth thing is an expert, independent and trusted decision-maker in the form of a national EPA to work with the government and Parliament to protect the national interest. And the fifth is enabling the operation of natural capital markets that assist in the achievement of both net zero and nature repair goals. Economics is concerned with optimising choices. Optimisation exercises demand careful specification, not only of what is being targeted, but just as importantly, of the constraints that determine the set of feasible choices. If the constraints are misspecified, then decisions will be suboptimal. Over the past 100 years or so, economics has, for the most part, ignored the most important constraints on human choices. These are embedded in the immutable laws of nature. They're embedded in chemistry, in physics and biology. Human development is necessarily constrained by these laws. Our failure to recognise that that is so, to recognise that the laws of nature affect the set of feasible choices available to us as humans, is now having a discernible impact on productivity. And things are getting worse with accelerating speed. Lifting productivity growth is going to require much better articulation of the natural constraints affecting the choices available to us. These must be written into law in the form of enforceable national environmental standards. In reforming the EPBC Act, we can get this right. We've had all the reviews we need. All of us has had our say. It's now up to Parliament. Let's just get this done, shall we?
Ken, as many of us would have anticipated, many thoughtful arguments deployed there. For a midwinter period here in Canberra, there is actually a long list of journalists, colleagues here who would like to ask questions. I'll just seek one myself using my own prerogative. On clarity, you make the point at the end about all the work having been done. You reference liberally the work of your friend Graham Samuel and before him the Hawke Review. Just to clarify your own model, the best practice you have in mind, is it contained in the Samuel report, or do you have ideas that go above and beyond in your advocacy in the months ahead?
It's all contained in Graham's report. It is all there. It just needs to be implemented. Of course, there's matters of detail that need to be sorted out. That's the case with any proposed reform, economic reform. But these are matters of detail, right? The key recommendations that Graham has made, I'm supporting all of them.
Okay. All right, let's bring in the colleagues, and Kat Wong from AAP has the first question today.
Thank you for your address today, Dr. Henry. So, for the last couple of decades of your career, you've been urging the need for tax reform alongside the need to do more for the environment. It appears you could theoretically at least partially address this with one stone, especially given that Labor has a massive mandate in the upcoming term. Do you think it's time to reconsider a carbon tax?
What do we mean by reconsider? Why the hell did we ever drop it? I mean, that's the question, right? It still boggles the mind that we had the world's best carbon policy and then, for purely political reasons, decided that we could afford to do without it. A country that's capable of creating the best and then decides that it doesn't need anything at all, well, my God. Of course we need a carbon tax, but in the meantime, we've got something else, and we've got to make the something else work, right? And I am not of the view that without a carbon tax we should just give up. I am not of that view. Clearly I'm not of that view, and that's why I'm here. We've got to make what we've got work.
Thank you.
Shane Wright.
Dr. Henry, good to see you again. You've touched on the Federation and the powers of the states who constitutionally are responsible for land in the country. How big a problem do you think the Federation is? You've touched on the EPA.
Yeah.
We've got plenty of examples of state governments overruling their own EPAs. Yeah. So do you think you will, and you also touched on the fact that the Commonwealth may need to put more funding to this space. Yeah. Does that also include financial incentives to the states to get off their asses?
Yeah, and I like your choice of language. That's how I would have put it as well, Shane. Exactly. Yes, I do think so. Right. This is not new, right? We've had the Federation for a very long time, right? And we've always had this contest on endless number of policy issues between the Commonwealth on the one hand and the states and territories on the other. The reason we have the EPBC Act is because, although for decades the Commonwealth was able to pretend that there was no real environmental problem in the way the states and territories were doing things, eventually the Commonwealth said, and this was a Conservative, a coalition government by the way, oh hell, okay, right, obviously we can't get away with that anymore, we better do something ourselves, and sought to come in over the top. Turns out a cooperative model is what was needed. Now, in the past, we have achieved cooperation between the Commonwealth and the states. Invariably, it has involved fiscal transfers from the Commonwealth to the states. It's simply being realistic to assume, I think, that something of that sort will be required. The precise form of it, well, who knows? That's up for negotiation, as it should be, between the Prime Minister and the Premiers, or between the various treasurers of the Commonwealth and the states and territories. But I know how the system works, and that is how the system works, Shane, and you know it too, right?
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. Matthew Cranston from The Australian.
Thanks, Mr. Henry. It's really interesting. All this deregulation ultimately goes towards more output, productivity, and that helps address the revenue side of the ledger for governments through tax. I'm interested in the other side of the ledger, which is spending. Mm-hmm. As former Treasurer Secretary, I'm curious that there's this global problem now on spending, and public are quite apathetic towards it. We've seen in America a huge blowout in the deficit now, so much so that Elon Musk has had to come out and break with Trump to try and get a little bit more public awareness of the dangers of big spending. So in Australia, I wonder, do you think there needs to be more done on spending policy? To use your words, your language, are we stealing from the future? Is there policy paralysis around spending? And also, if I can just sneak in another question on unrealised capital gains tax.
Oh. I can see the connection, yeah, right, okay.
Did you ever find out why they never used your recommendation for a rebate model on super? And I wonder, are all those recommendations from the Henry Review still valid?
Thank you, Matt. I noticed you didn't have a pen there, Ken, so you'll have to.
No, I'm right. So let me. Well, I think I am. We'll see, won't we? Yeah. Let me answer the second part of the question first. Every recommendation of the Henry Review remains valid, right? That's simple. Actually, that's the first time I've ever called it the Henry Review. There you go. You must have got me excited. It was not my intention, but there is. Let me put it this way: there's nothing in that review that I would. No, I would write bits of it differently, but only to sharpen it up, not to change the substance of it. And that includes with respect to superannuation, right? So I've answered that part of the question, at least as far as I'm prepared to answer it. As far as the spending side of the budget's concerned, look, so in general, and you were asking about the need for spending discipline and whether we've got a problem there, and in general, I'm going to agree with you. I'm not going to address specifics, right? But I would make the point, and to bring it back to the topic under discussion today, that when we published the first intergenerational report way back in 2002, right, 23 years ago, we published projections, I'm talking about the Treasury, led by Treasurer Costello, we published projections for the spending side of the budget, which actually are not that far off where we are. And what we said was, if the budget is to meet these growing spending pressures, then we've got two options. We either increase taxes as a share of GDP, or we grow the economy faster. There's only two options, and that's what we said at the time. We have grown the economy slower, much, much slower. For example, and just to illustrate that, over the decade of the 1990s, average productivity growth was 2.31% a year. Don't ask me why I carry this in my head, but I do. 2.31% a year. Over the past 25 years, it's averaged 0.98% a year. That's a pretty fundamental difference, right? That's pretty fundamental. If we continue on that trajectory, as we said in 2002, we will have no option but to raise taxes, and quite significantly by several percentage points of GDP. So that's the other side of the budget story.
Or cut spending.
Or cut spending well below what was projected in the intergenerational reports.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Let's bring in the Mandarin, and from it, Melissa Code.
Thank you for your talk today, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. So recently, particularly under the Albanese government, we've heard of the public service turn its mind to things like the wellbeing economy, concepts like strategic foresight. And despite all of this sort of genuine effort to combat what you coin policy paralysis, there's still the reality that a ministerial's operating environment is inherently short-term. It encounters difficulty looking to the far horizon.
Yeah.
There are people alive today who may well be still alive at the 22nd century. How do we sort of really cut through where those two issues butt heads?
Yeah, I love the question. I've spent a large part of my life pondering that very question. And the question is really important to people who are interested in public policy, because if you ask yourself the question, as I often did and still do, what is the point of public policy, you've got to come up with an answer that somehow talks about benefits accruing to future generations. I mean, I like the formulation that says that every generation should aspire to future generations enjoying a better standard of living than the one that we enjoy. I like it. I think that's what we should do. Problem is, who's holding the political system accountable for the delivery of that? Because we're really talking about what we should really be interested in is what is Australia going to look like in 100 years' time? And I believe, none of the politicians with us today will be alive in 100 years' time, and nobody's going to hold them accountable for the delivery of that. And this short-termism, now you could argue that it's unavoidable, but we should not accept that. So my view has been that what we need is enhanced transparency mechanisms that publish, so the people like you can read an explanation from the government of the day about the future impact of the decisions that are being taken today. This is the theory that lies behind the Charter of Budget Honesty Act, which I have to say to you is in breach. It's in breach, and it's been in breach for a long, long time now. This is where the intergenerational report came from. It's actually required by the Charter of Budget Honesty Act, and it's required to publish 40-year projections, for heaven's sake, right? It's these sorts of transparency mechanisms that we have to rely upon. But look, the thing is this, unless the media holds the political system to account on these things, they're not going to be observed. So it's critical. We used to talk about the critical role played by the Fourth Estate. You know what that means. Most people out there in Australia wouldn't have a clue what that expression, the Fourth Estate, means. It's time that we rebuilt it.
Support for that in this room at the National Press Club. John Keogh from the Australian Financial Review.
Thank you, Dr. Henry, for your speech on environmental laws, which we covered on the front page of the Financial Review today.
I took note. Thank you, John.
By my esteemed colleague Phil Curry. But I did want to ask you a broader question about taxation, but specifically the future of dividend imputation in this country and your thoughts on it. Your report 16 years ago did canvass that maybe at some stage in the future, dividend imputation might not be necessarily fit for purpose in its current shape or form. I think largely because foreign investors don't benefit from it. We're becoming a more global capital world. We need to attract the marginal investor, which is often a foreign investor.
Yeah.
Do you think dividend imputation in its current form should remain in its current form, or do you think it could be used, for example, as a trade-off to cut the company tax rate or something like that?
Yeah, I wouldn't rule it out at all, John. And look, we in the review, as you say, 16 years ago, and correctly, we didn't go so far as to recommend wholesale change to the dividend imputation system, but we did observe that in a world of globally mobile capital, where we are a capital importer, oh, by the way, in recent years we haven't always been a capital importer, which in itself points to quite possibly a significant economic problem, but that in that world, the cost of capital to Australian corporates is pretty much determined by the world price. And we can't do much to influence the world price of capital. To the extent that we put a company tax on top, that increases the cost of capital to Australian corporates. but domestic resident shareholders, they get it all back. So actually our company tax system with imputation amounts to a tariff on imported equity capital. That's actually what it is. It's a tariff on imported equity capital, and it has, you know, the protective effect, benefits resident shareholders, including Australian superannuation funds. So there is some return to the Australian population from that, but there is nevertheless a disincentive to business investment. And if we don't change the imputation system, and I can understand why that would be a difficult thing to do, if we don't change it, we've got to find some other way of incentivising people with mobile capital finding a reason to invest in Australia rather than somewhere else. Yeah. Thanks. So I guess what I'm saying, John, is that if we have the opportunity for a broad-ranging discussion about tax reform in this term of Parliament, the question that you've raised has to be on the table. Thanks.
Well, apparently we might be having that conversation, so let's see where it takes us. A diversity to questions today. Let's see what Tom McElroy from The Guardian has.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you, Dr. Henry, for taking our questions. We had your speech on our front page today as well.
That was noted too. Thank you.
Could I ask you, please, about the way that both environmental law and taxation, for that matter, is often administered through regulation? There's another outbreak of the need to cut red tape in the political and media discourse here in Canberra at the moment. Is that problematic? Is good regulation necessary to make sure these systems run well? Isn't part of the message of your speech and your calls for changes of the EPBC Act that good regulation should be allowed to exist and be looked after, not cut, not derided?
Well, actually, what I was trying to say in the speech is that we can have better regulation at the same time cut red tape. That we can get rid of a lot of the complexity, the duplication, the uncertainty, the cost of approvals processes, and so on. That there is a way of achieving both. And that's true of other areas of policy as well, by the way. But in respect of environmental law reform, the key insight there is that you've got the multiple layers of regulation. You've got Commonwealth, you've got state, you've also got local government, right? There's got to be a way, and this is what Graham Samuel focused on in his review, and what I've been talking about today, there's got to be a way of simplifying all of that. So not adding red tape, but adding, or just making it clearer, more certain, and then making sure that it's properly enforced, right? That it's not something that sits on the statute books but doesn't really change people's behaviour. That was the whole point of it, of what I was trying to say today. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
All right, let's go to the ABC and Gareth Hutchins.
Hey, Ken.
Hi, Gareth.
Yesterday, in his judgment for Pabai v Commonwealth, Federal Court Judge Michael Wigney found that when Australia's government set our emissions reduction targets in 2015, 2020 and 2021, it failed to engage with or give any genuine consideration to what was the best available science and what it said we needed to do to reduce emissions and play our part in the global emissions reductions. He said evidence also indicated that those emissions targets that we set in those years were plainly not consistent with Australia's international obligations under the Paris Agreement. So what do we do about this? Like, you say we need another period of cooperative reform, like the 1980s and 1990s. But on this topic, we still don't have every government in Australia caring about the science. So would the recommendations you're pushing for today, if pursued and locked in, solve that problem somehow by embedding respect for the science in binding national standards?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I probably should have articulated it that way, because that puts it rather well. What has been missing here is a respect for the science, is a respect for the evidence, is a respect for the truth. That's clearly been missing here. And I see part of the role, hopefully, of Environment Information Australia is that it does demystify this stuff, and that it states very clearly, these are the facts. This is what the evidence shows. Bang, bang. And that it does so in a timely fashion, that we don't have to wait years to find out what the environment looked like, you know, in 2025. I think that's a key part of it. It's also critical that the best information be brought to the table in the project approvals processes, so that there can be no debate about what the true environmental impact is. But most importantly, and I tried to set this out in the speech, most importantly, that science has to be brought to the table earlier in the development of regional plans, which allow for policymakers to determine which parts of that landscape absolutely must be protected. There can be no development there. Which parts of the landscape might be fit for residential development, which for commercial development, where the power lines might go, where the roads might go, and so on. That's when the science has to be brought to the table. That's where the big decisions should be taken, is in that regional planning approach or exercise. And regional planning necessarily involves all three levels of government. There's no getting away from it, right? So it forces cooperation. Now, in my view, it's up to the Parliament to decide where they land on this, but in my view, that, enshrining that model, should be a core component of any system that allows for the Commonwealth to accredit powers of the states and territories.
All right, next question from Amy Ramikis, the New Daily.
Hello, who doesn't like spending as much time as possible with economists? The New South Wales government appears to be holding out on declaring the Great Koala National Park because it's waiting for carbon offsets. And other jurisdictions have managed to declare protected areas without those financial incentives. So doesn't that show a potential flaw with essentially privatising protecting the environment? And should the CFI Act be amended so governments can't manipulate the timing of delivering their policy commitments to receive those financial incentives?
Yeah, it's a well-constructed question. See,
it's what I do.
I'm a fan of the Great Koala National Park, right? I'm also a fan of carbon credits being used to fund the management of the Great Koala National Park, because God knows how else it's going to be funded. You look at, I have deep respect for the National Parks and Wildlife Service of New South Wales. I travel through national parks in New South Wales, and what I see is underspending, under-resourcing everywhere, right? If we're going to get the resources on the ground to have high-quality national parks so that those, what are presently forests being logged, are maintained and maintain high ecological integrity, and in a way that facilitates tourism and so on, we are going to have to spend more money. And the only place I can see that money coming from is from carbon credits. And I understand why people don't like the idea of carbon credits, but if you look at the Climate Change Authority's net zero projections, we're going to need carbon credits in Australia that support the sequestration, by 2050, the sequestration of about 120 million tonnes of carbon a year, which is many multiples, 10 to 15 times the volume of carbon credits we're presently generating. So I understand people having concerns about the use of carbon credits. We're going to have to get used to it. And what that means is we're going to have to figure out how to ensure that these carbon credits are really high integrity carbon credits, to go back to an earlier question, based on the best science. Then we've got a hope of achieving net zero by 2050.
All right, just a quick housekeeping note. We're probably entering the last 6 or 7 minutes or so, so we'll get through as many more as we can. Next question from Spectator Australia and Michael De Percy.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Dr. Henry. In the Hilmer review, your review and the Harper review, there was a focus on some elements of transport reform. Much of that has not happened. Now, the transport sector produces 22%, according to the Department of Climate Change, of carbon emissions. And what we're seeing, though, is this entire focus on wind and solar. And I'm just wondering, at what point, to the independent spectator, is this about wind and solar and not actually about net zero, given that the transport sector already has assets that we're not sweating? We don't need to destroy habitats to use these assets because they're already there, whereas wind and solar is all about habitat destruction, especially the new assets. So where do we draw the line here?
Yeah, I don't think. I don't think we should allow ourselves to assume that wind and solar is necessarily about habitat destruction, right? But I get your point. But I think we can do better than that. I really do. With respect to transport, I think there's a view that if we can get renewable energy then everybody will be driving electric vehicles. And so what's the greenhouse gas issue, right? And it's possible, like it is possible, that renewable energy solves both problems, right? The 30% or so that's electricity and energy related, and then the 22% that's related to transport. It is possible, right? But it reminds me of another debate that we've been having on and off for a little while, and I see that it's resurfaced again recently, which is in that world, how do we charge people for access to the nation's road network, right? It's a really important question, because traditionally we've relied upon the diesel fuel excise and the petrol excise for funding. Now there's no explicit relationship, but nevertheless we've kind of told ourselves that there's a funding base there for the road network. And in a world in which the vehicle fleet is fully electrified, that just disappears, of course. And, you know, again, in our tax review, we were working on 16 years ago, we did not anticipate the electrification of the vehicle fleet. Nevertheless, I would encourage you, all of you, to go and read what the tax review said about a road user vehicle charging scheme, and had we implemented that scheme, this problem would have been solved. In fact, there would be no discussion about how we charge electric vehicles for access to the road network, because it just would have happened seamlessly, right? But I think we've got to do it, right? We do have to do it. So I'd say there's two bits. The first is electrification will help, but then secondly, we've still got to pay for the road network, and we're going to need a new source of revenue, and the new source of revenue is obviously road user charges. And I do not accept that we're incapable of figuring out how to do this.
Thank you.
Striking how many ideas from that paper still resonate here today. Phil Curry from the Australian Financial Review.
Cheers, Greg. Thanks, Dr. Henry. Just look, to sort of a two-part question, vaguely related. I'd like your view on the unfolding and escalating marine catastrophe in South Australia.
Oh, yeah.
It's been going for 3 months now,
Yeah.
and particularly the refusal of the federal government to either meet a funding request by the marine scientists to get a handle on it, and even meet with the marine scientists. And sort of the second part is that crisis has led to calls by South Australians, including Sarah Hanson-Young, to put a climate trigger in the EPBC Act. Could I get your view on that as well? Do you think that should be part of the EPBC reform?
Two pretty tough questions, Phil. I would expect nothing less. Well done. So here's the thing. Look, what's happening in South Australia with the massive destruction of marine life, that's not an early warning, that's a late warning, right? That's a late warning. It's well past time that we and others in the world dealt properly with the threats of climate change and the warming of the oceans, which I think, from what I've read, lies at the heart of the catastrophe that's occurring there. It's another wake-up call, but it's not an early wake-up call. We should have been well awake decades ago. And of course, some people were. Some people were awake decades ago and were calling for action decades ago. And I think that's how we should treat this. As to funding between the Commonwealth and the states to allow South Australia to fund scientists or whatever, that's the argy-bargy of fiscal relations between states, and I don't want to get into the specifics. As to a climate trigger, you know, it was interesting in the ACBF, we went back and reread Alan Hawke's report, and actually in my prepared remarks I made reference to it. And Alan said that in a world, or at least in Australia, with an economy-wide price on carbon, such as you would have with a carbon tax or with an emissions trading scheme, which is what we were talking about in Australia at the time when he wrote his report. In such a world, there would be no obvious case for a climate trigger. But in a world in which those things are lacking, a climate trigger on major developments should be something which is open for discussion, something we need to think about. Now, at the moment, what we have is something which is nowhere near an economy-wide price on carbon. We don't have a carbon tax, we don't have an emissions trading scheme. We decided we didn't want either of those things. Instead, what we've got is a set of arrangements which I can imagine could one day be transformed into an economy-wide price on carbon. I can imagine how that would happen. We're a hell of a long way from that. So I would say, right now, everything's on the table. There's no good logical argument for saying, oh no, we shouldn't look at that. We should only look at this because this is all we've been talking about for the past several years. What we've been talking about for the past several years is patently not enough.
Thank you.
Right, I think for obvious reasons, at least one of the channels that is taking this address today is prepared to hold on a little bit longer. So with that in mind, we can probably squeeze a couple more questions with your consent, Ken. Let's go to Gemma Daly, Director here at the club.
Hey, Dr. Henry. If someone told me that a chat on environmental reform could be so compelling, I probably would have questioned that. So thank you very much. And I'm also from Australian Industry Group, which is actually not the natural enemy of the principles you're talking about. I wanted to ask you about productivity. In your 2002 intergenerational report, you had a forecast for the sort of productivity we would need to have.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could tell us about that and tell us also about the per capita cost of that not happening.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay, so this, yeah. Look, at the time when we put that intergenerational report together in 2002, the 30-year average rate of productivity growth in Australia, so that's over the 70s, 80s and 90s, had averaged 1.75%. In the 1990s, it actually lifted to 2.25% through the 1990s. That's the average over the whole decade. And by the way, that includes a recession. So, and then when we put the report together, we said, well, we're producing projections. We don't really know what productivity growth is going to be. Instead, what we should do is we should publish a projection. This is what it's going to look like if we produce productivity growth at the same rate as the average of the past 30 years. So we said, let's, for the sake of putting projections together, let's assume it's 1.75, right? And then we said, and obviously, that's going to lead to the need to raise taxes by 5 percentage points of GDP, if that's all we can achieve, right? So then we said, well, that's a pretty compelling argument for finding ways of boosting productivity growth. From the 1.75 projection up to what? Well, we said, we've got to repeat the 1990s. If we can repeat the 1990s for 40 years, now that's a big ask, I know, but that's what it was going to take. If we can repeat the 1990s for 40 years, then we can avoid the need to lift the tax to GDP ratio. We can get through this without taxing people harder and on more things that they buy and sell. And what did we achieve? We didn't achieve the 1.75. We certainly didn't achieve the 2.25. What we've achieved is closer to 0.75% a year. And the gap, it's actually 0.98. But the gap, so it's closer to 1. But the gap between what we achieved over the past 25 years and the 1990s, if you just, the average in the 1990s, if you just asked yourself the question like I have recently, in a quiet moment, my God, assuming that real wages grow pretty much in line with productivity growth, how much has this cost the average Australian worker? And I came up with a remarkable number that it's cost the average full-time worker in Australia more than $500,000 over the past 25 years. And so, you know, when I hear people say, oh, we can't do this to enhance productivity, we can't do that to enhance productivity because you know what, it's going to hurt somebody, I think, give me a break. Who are we talking about here? The average full-time Australian worker has been robbed of about $500,000 over the past 25 years because of our failure to achieve. Now, maybe that level of productivity growth was never going to be achieved, right? But achieving a bit less than 1% when we are projected 1.75 and targeted 2.25, it's not good enough.
Thank you.
All right. Look, I regret to say, I'm sorry, Nick, we're going to have to bring the curtain down on questions, much as all of us, I think, would like to stay and hear much more from Ken, seamlessly bridging everything from EPBC in your speech through to road user charges, the Great Koala National Park, dividend imputation and more. We'd expect nothing less from you, Ken, and it is a timely address that you've given here today, and reassuring to know that after a lifetime spent in public policy making, Ken Henry remains vitally engaged in it, in the discussions we're about to have. Ken, thanks for coming and your guest membership to the National Press Club. Let's hear it for Ken.